All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, August 10th, 2021. Thanks for tuning in here. Whether you're watching me live or watching this back as a recording, appreciate you being here. If this is your first time watching our stream here, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. We get questions in through email. We get questions in through YouTube chat, through our Office Hours channel in Slack. We just take these questions one at a time, talk through these things, talk about all the nuance, everything that there is to break down on some of these DFS concepts or questions or whatever. So we do the show live for a reason. I want follow-up questions and clarifying questions from you guys, right? I want engagement. I want, if you have your 2 cents or a particular piece of strategy or something that you use, if we're talking about correlation and stacking and you've got some thoughts on that topic, I want you to shout them out. So the best 2 places to do that or on YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel on Slack. When there are comments and questions that are coming in on the stream, I'll typically pull them up, talk about them, make sure I'm answering any follow-up questions there are. So that is the whole reason that the show has the format that it does, right? We want engagement from you guys. So those are the best 2 places to do that. We've got a few questions here in the queue today. Actually, quite a few now. We've got a decent, maybe half dozen questions, so we will get through everything. But as always, if you've got a question, if you want something for me to tackle, go ahead and pop it into the YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack early, so I can build up a little bit of a queue here and know what's in front of me, know how many questions there are, so I make sure I make time for everything. But first off, it's been kind of a bit of a heater for the SaberSim community here this week and last week. I know there were a bunch of wins we were shouting out last week and over the weekend, but congrats to Safety Dance and Jim here and the Knit. I saw some screenshots from everybody here earlier today from all these guys. So awesome work. We'll keep it going. Keep the SaberSim avatars up at the top of the DraftKings and FanDuel lobby. So that's awesome to see. Jim said, "You rock." Hey man, congrats on the decent little score. I saw 8th place here for a nice little hit in a single entry. Good looking lineup. Torrin said hello. What's up, man? Welcome everybody. We're getting a few people in here now. Oh, that's the default StreamYard comment. But we got a few people in here, so we'll go ahead and just get started. So again, if you missed the very quick introduction, if you got questions for me, pop them into YouTube chat. We'll get to everything. We'll talk through everything here today. But I'm going to get started. We'll pull the app up here, get this going. It's a 15-game slate. These Tuesday slates are pretty awesome. They've been a lot of fun. Definitely a lot of different ways to play these. Quite a bit better than the slate we had last night. I played the freaking weather game again. I was up here with Danny. What was that now? Like 2 weeks ago, talking about weather, and like the general theme of that strategy session we did about handling weather was to be conservative and to fade these games. And I played the Brewers Cubs again. I need my like, clown mask or whatever, because ended up donating most of my entries last night, but that's okay. It's a new slate, 15 games tonight. Feels a lot easier to fade a weather game if there is one. I think Oakland, Cleveland has a little bit of weather concern, so it should be a lot more fun tonight. But we'll go ahead and get started here. Jim, I know you had a question here for me from right at the start. That's the first one I've got in my queue. Sometimes I'd like to set a max exposure on larger slates, say like 30% or so, but SaberSim just ignores me and still jams in 75% guys. Not sure if I should hold on to my exposure. Maybe SaberSim is trying to tell me something. So Jim, I'm going to ask you kind of a quick question here. Are you referring to this max exposure? My impression when I saw this question came in is yes, right? So what I'm gonna assume that you're talking about this max exposure. If you're not, let me know and we'll shift gears. But if we're talking about this, so what this max exposure actually does is this is going to affect the exposure of a player in your. Okay, so yeah, Jim said, yep. This is going to affect the entire exposure of your entire pool, right? So we've seen here a bunch. When we say that we're going to build 20 lineups, we're actually going to build 500. That allows us to sort, get the best 20 out of a pool of 500. It also allows us to edit our exposures dynamically in step 3, right? This max exposure is referring to the big pool, your total pool of lineups, your 500. So if we do go in here and set 30, and then we run our build, it's going to make sure that no player is used in more than 30% of the entire pool of 500. But you might still get more of those players popping up into your pool of 20 based on the way that we sort the lineups overall. So It's a little bit confusing. The idea there is that max exposure should really only be used if you're trying to create a lot of additional diversity in your entire big pool. If you're trying to just create diversity in your lineups overall, we recommend turning smart diversity up. That's going to lower the exposures you have overall. I'll let this build finish, and I'll kind of continue my point here and then talk about a few other things related to this. But we'll go ahead and just let this finish because I don't want to get ahead of myself real quick here. But Jim said, oh, I get it. Yeah, it's a little confusing. We've gotten some questions on this here before. I know it's not the easiest thing to realize right off the bat, but let me let this build finish. We have some improvements or some changes here kind of coming to around some of this stuff. So, okay. So let's go ahead and quickly edit this, and I'll show you how this is actually working. So you can see here right away, right? We're getting players that are higher than 30%. But if we expand this to 500, what we should see is that we are capped. No player is owned in more than 30% of the entire pool of 500, right? So it's going to allow us to get some overall diversity. It should make it a little bit more flexible to then go in and put maximum exposures on players, right? Because we know that there's enough lineups to do this anyway. So now if we want to go in and actually say 30% maximum on all of our players, it does make it a little bit easier to do this. You're less likely to get the message saying that you need to build more lineups because we've already built a pool that's a little bit more diverse to begin with. So you could go ahead and do this. Jim said, how do you expand to 500? Like you just said, yeah. So this is a really good tool. I do this a lot on stream. So this little lineups field here, lineups 20, this is editable. You can change this. So you can increase this to whatever you want. You can look at the top 100, right? That's going to show you the top 100. The way I like to use this in general most often is to view the full pool. So I'm changing this to 500. So it's just viewing the whole thing. You're going to lose the ability to edit exposures here because you can't edit exposures when you're looking at the entire lineup set. But it's useful to like look at this here and see, we do this all the time. We do it for our chalk builds to determine what the field is going to do. We do it to look at our research builds to figure out how often a player is optimal. This can be a really useful tool to expand the full pool. So again, kind of coming around full circle here, I would say this max exposure, oops, I opened up a couple of these. This max exposure here is referring to the entire pool. If you want to increase the diversity of your lineups in general, I would first more recommend increasing smart diversity, right? Because what this is doing is that it's, yes, increasing the diversity, but it's also doing it in a way that's also increasing the upside of your lineups and making your lineups better because it's using smaller buckets of sims to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup. So this is going to increase diversity in a way that actually emphasizes upside, whereas this is going to, one, it only affects your entire pool, and two, it's only going to it's a bit of a brute force artificial method of increasing the diversity of your lineups. I would say if you're already using smart diversity at 10 and you want to even get more diverse lineups, then it's a good time to maybe start bringing this down. But I would say in general, probably best to leave this at 100. We are working on in our the visual update that we are hoping to ship out to everybody this month, or at least before the start of football season. Will include the ability to add min and max exposures for players before the build. So you will be able to go in and just say, I don't want more than 30% of any player, or you can do individual exposures and set that prior to running your build and then run the build and get a little bit more of what you were expecting. And we will still also have, of course, this max exposure here. But if you wanted to say no one to be owned more than 30% in the actual lineups I get, that is going to be an option here in the redesign that is we're getting very close on. So, but great question. Definitely one that has come up here before. And it looks like, Jim, that kind of helped. But if you got any more follow-up for me, let me know. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to get caught up to the questions that came in right before my show started here, and then we'll circle back around and get to the questions that came in YouTube. But let's see. Question from Fisty here, and it looks like probably a follow-up on a question that came in last week. Is there an easy way to view my one-off players in my builds? There really, to be completely honest, there really isn't in the way that I think I'm imagining you might want to, right? Like a way of saying like, is a one-off or something like that. Because what you can do here is you can isolate your stack types and then see who's actually the one-off in builds and stack types that have one-offs, right? So let's go ahead and reduce this back down to 20. But, oh, one sec. Give this a second here. Sometimes the build takes a little bit longer to pull up when it's pulling up the whole 500 lineups. So I'll just give this a second to catch up and then change this back down to 20 so it's a little easier to work with. Okay. Okay, so yeah, for example, like you could view your 4-3 lineups, which we know are going to be lineups that have a one-off. So in this case, it's Trey Turner. In this case, it's Max Muncy, right? And we can kind of visually see it. But I don't know if there's a great answer to, could you just look at your batters, for example, and like very quickly identify who's being used as a one-off? I may have to check and follow up and see if there's an easier way. There are some more interesting filter options. So I will say this, we're bringing also more robust filtering options with the redesign that will allow you to do things like show me, I don't know, Dodgers stacks that don't have a certain player or something like that. There may be a way to kind of finagle it around to get an idea of what your one-off players look like. But unfortunately, there's not really anything that's coming to mind here as like a very quick and easy way to just see all your one-offs at the moment. So sorry about that. But I would say, again, if you want to just get an idea of what players you are using in one-offs, I would do it via stack types and just identify stacking types that have a one-off. So obviously 5-3s don't, 3-3-2s don't, 4-3s do. So you can take a look at those. 5 stacks are going to have 3 one-offs. So you can take a look at those. 4-2-2s have no one-offs. 5-2s have 1 one-off. 3-2-2s have 1 one-off. So on. So that's probably the easiest way at the moment to do that. But cool. I guess the one other thing here, obviously, since I saw this note here and I missed this originally, is this question here of, I would like to review what one-offs I'm getting and what teams they're pulling my one-offs from. You could very easily kind of just get an idea of what your stacks are here and maybe just kind of like note what your stacks are and then quickly go through and look at your batters. You'd probably still need to have some manual work here. But you could kind of actually, you could really just get an idea just looking at this and see if there's any teams where you're only using a one-off, right? Like this is one that kind of stands out. We're clearly only using a single lineup with Tyrone Taylor. We don't have any Milwaukee stacks. Like this is one that I don't know exactly what your goal is here, Fisty, but like to me, this is one that stands out, right? This is a little weird. He's a cheap player. Yeah, he's batting in the middle of the order, but he's used as a single one-off and we're not using any Milwaukee stacks. Like maybe this is a little bit of a flag player. I would assume in a general sense, at least for me, that I would be comfortable using a one-off from a lot of the teams that I'm also comfortable stacking. So this would be another way of doing that. Like even Boston here, right? This is clearly most likely a single lineup. Oops. It doesn't like when you do it that way, but this is clearly, right, a single lineup with a Boston 3 stack. Oh, no, it's not. Okay. So yeah, there's limitations to going this way too, because it's actually a single Boston 2 stack and then probably one-off lineup where we use Devers. Yeah. So he is a one-off in this lineup. So yeah, a bit of a limitation there. Maybe not the most satisfying answer there, but should help maybe a little bit. So I'm going to keep us rolling. A question from Brian here came in on Slack. And he said, if I'm entering 10 lineups into a 20 max contest and say I use Scherzer in all 10, should I consider myself to be 100% exposed to Scherzer or 50% since I only used him in 50% of my possible lineups? Probably just overthinking things, but curious on your thoughts. Thanks. Yeah, so in that case, you would best be thought about it as being 100% exposed to Scherzer, right? Because the whole reason we think about exposure in that way is really comparing it against the field. So if, say, the field had 50% Scherzer and you have 100%, you are twice as exposed. Your pool of lineups stand to gain twice as much when Scherzer succeeds than the field does, right? The lineups that you did not enter into that contest, in this case, the missing 10 lineups, don't really matter here. So when you're thinking about your exposures and how exposed you are against the field and things like that, it's best just compare it to the lineups that you've actually entered, rather than the hypothetical max, right? Even if you enter 3 contests into 150 max, right, it would still be the same thing. You would be 0%, 33%, 66%, or 100% exposed to any one player. You wouldn't want to consider it against the entire max entry limit. So, but with that said, while I have the opportunity to talk about this, I would say if you can, I would recommend trying to play a 20 max contest, even if it is at a lower dollar amount that you can afford to max it out, right? You're playing at a bit of a disadvantage in this contest, playing just 10 lineups, because the sharpest players are always the ones that max the contest out, right? In general, solid rule of thumb. Weaker players are those that are throwing only a couple bullets in. Sharper players, stronger players overall are the ones maxing it out. You want to give yourself as many opportunities against the sharpest players in the pool, or as many opportunities against the sharpest players in a contest to give yourself a fair chance of taking it down, right? So if you are playing, maybe you're playing the $4 20 max. I know that's a popular contest on DraftKings, and just entering 10 lineups, that's $40. I would say it'd be very easy to jump down to something like the solo shot, which is a $1 20 max. That's only $20 to max. And then you can max that out. You've got as many lineups as the best hypothetical player in that contest, and you're giving yourself a little bit more of an advantage. So small contest selection thing there. You could even play the solo shot and the quarter jukebox. That'd be $20, $25. You could play those with unique lineups. Give yourself 40 unique lineups. Give yourself a lot more opportunities to smooth out variance, have more success with a lot less bankroll invested as well. So definitely in general, when you can, recommend maxing out contests. I recommend picking contests that you can afford to max out. And if you don't think you can build or manage the amount of lineups in the contest, maybe you're looking at the mini max 150 max and you're thinking, I don't want to play 150 lineups, or I don't want to manage 150 lineups, or I don't think there's 150 good lineups to play tonight, then I would recommend in general, I wouldn't play that contest. I know there's a lot of people out there that maybe play 40 to 60 lineups and 150 maxes, and they're profitable, right? But I still think you put yourself at a small disadvantage and might have found that money better invested into 20 maxes or things like that. But anyway, bit of a contest selection rant for me here, so I will get off that topic and move us on. But Brian, if you're watching here, let me know if that was helpful for your original question here, and we'll keep it rolling. But there was a quick question from James asking about golf projections for this week. That is just like a small bug. I think we will have the golf projections and ownership up here shortly. I know there was another user, I think, that maybe asked in support earlier about it, but those should be up shortly. So we will definitely have golf projections for this week. All right, one sec here. Okay, so another question from James here. This came in on Slack as well. In a 7-inning game, is it best practice to exclude batters or pitchers, or both? What's the impact typically playing 7-inning games, positive or negative, as far as using these players? This is a great question, and it's an opportunity to talk a little bit again about what is the value of game simulations, right? A traditional optimizer using a basic average set of projections isn't going to be very well equipped to dealing with the problem of 7-inning games. I think what you're going to see on traditional optimizers most often, and probably with our average projections, is that most people that are building like average basic average projections are just going to take 7/9 of their player projections for the players playing in the 7-inning game, which is roughly 77%, and apply it as like a flat multiplier against the player projections, right? And that might work fine in a sport like something like basketball, where scoring happens often, very linearly throughout the game. There's a little less variance. But in a sport like baseball, taking 77% of every player's average projection because they're playing in a 7-inning game isn't actually going to be very useful, because first of all, a single at bat for a hitter might make their entire night and might put them in the 85th percentile. And yeah, I guess like that's kind of the point, right? So the value that we get is that we simulate these games even when they're 7 innings, right? We run play-by-play simulations thousands of times to determine not only our projections, but the ranges of outcomes for players. So the 7-inning game tonight, I think, is this Milwaukee one, right? Or is the Toronto game also 7 innings? I think they might both be. But when we actually say that we have these projections for players, right? This is from our game play-by-play game simulations for the 7-inning game. And it allows us to do a few things. It allows us to recognize that there is probably overall a lower, maybe a lower average performance for batters, right? Batters are typically going to get one less at bat. Their average performance is going to go down. But they are likely that they still possess the ceiling overall, the ranges of outcomes. It is, James said Toronto 7 innings. I think it might be both, but it could be, maybe it's just one, because this game got postponed last night, but whatever. It works either way, right? These guys still have the ceilings outcomes of the one swing of the bat home run, right? That puts them in a ceiling outcome. So because we're simulating the games, you're never going to get these players playing in the 7-inning games on a traditional optimizer that optimizes for average performance, because their projection is 80% of everyone else at their salary range. But because we use game play-by-play simulations and then use smart diversity to pick out small buckets of simulations, it is at least possible that you could get some of these guys in your lineups. And their ceiling, while the average performance of hitters goes down for a 7-inning game, the ceiling doesn't really go down that much, right? You know, most of these guys, when they have their ceiling performance as hitters, or when a stack has a ceiling performance, they don't even need all their at-bats necessarily, right? So that's one side of it. The other side of it is on the pitchers. So pitchers playing in 7-inning games are typically much more likely to have an opportunity at a complete game, or even a complete game shutout. They only have to get through 7 innings. Not only is it less time, are they more likely to just pitch 7 innings, but since the opposing offense is going to get less shots at it, it's just a more possible outcome, right? These things happen at a greater rate. That's another thing that's going to show up in our ranges of outcomes and are in our game simulations for pitchers. So even though pitchers, so actually I think pitchers in general show up very well or grade out as pretty strong options in 7-inning games. They maybe lose a little bit of the opportunity where they could pitch like a legitimate 9-inning game shutout, where their ceiling would be sky high, but even a 7-game shutout is going to give them an opportunity to capture that bonus. So wrapping around here, I wouldn't do either excluding or forcing them in or anything on your 7-inning games, and just allow smart diversity and our game simulations to do that work for you, right? The ceilings, the average projections are going to get a little bit of a hit. They aren't games that I would say you're typically going to find yourself overly stacking, but a traditional optimizer is basically just going to remove these guys from the pool because of the way that they handle their projections. Whereas we can take advantage of the game sims to include these guys and get opportunities for their upside, especially when there's really good hitting teams, right? Like the Blue Jays and Brewers are both good hitting teams. And there's going to be sets of game sims. There's going to be random buckets of game simulations amongst these 15 games where a stack of those teams are optimal. So I think it's a good case study of talking about this to emphasize how cool and how valuable projections by game simulations are, as opposed to just raw projections. It's a really good example to show why average projections are kind of pretty much useless, to be completely honest, in a sport like baseball when you're playing GPPs. So, but great question. Again, from the practical side, I would just let it ride. I wouldn't exclude. I wouldn't force exposure to them. I would let smart diversity do a lot of the work and give you the exposure that it thinks kind of makes sense to those teams. So, but really good question. Okay, cool. So a question from Ryan here. And he said, I'm still having a massive issue understanding how to identify higher owned MLB stacks. Shoot the link to any video content if it's already been discussed, please. Thanks, SaberSim team. Yeah, I've talked about this a fair bit here in some other office hours videos, but I will continue to kind of dive in here. And I know you had another question, Ryan, about FanDuel. So we'll just go ahead and switch over to FanDuel and talk about this. So again, I think the most valuable tool here overall is taking advantage of Vegas when you're thinking about trying to identify the chalk, because so much of the MLB projections and content and tout advice that you find out there is just very driven from Vegas. I think if you're finding that it's very difficult overall for you to judge what the chalk is going to be, I would take a very intentional approach. I like to use this Fantasy Labs Vegas dashboard. And what I would do is use SaberSim, use Vegas odds combined with SaberSim as a way to build lineups that are going to look like what people using traditional optimizers are going to do, right? So this is a little bit tedious at the moment because it's going to require you to manually set all these team totals to the right numbers and then to reset them back later. This is a big 15-game slate, so I'm not going to do this with every team right here on the stream, but I believe this is the greatest way overall to get an idea of what teams and players are going to be chalky, specifically at least for baseball. So what that would look like is I would go in to, it doesn't have to be the Fantasy Labs tool, right? I just think this one's very useful. It's quick, it's easy. I would go in here and set the odds for the games playing on the slate. Be careful. This is the first game, so be careful with this one. But go in and set these to match up to what Vegas is, right? By adjusting these up or down accordingly. Do all of these, every single game on the slate. And what we're doing here is we're trying to get our projections to match what the field is going to do, right? What somebody that just picks up a random set of projections that uses Vegas as a heavily weighted input, a lot of the projection systems out there will do. And see what the projections do. And we'll go and get all these, right? So I'll just do a few teams to start, and we'll leave it there. You'll find that these often are not super far off, but especially on a 15-game slate, every little point of difference here is going to make a difference with the overall way the slate breaks out, especially big games like this, right? This is one that we like very much want to make sure that gets in here. That's probably a question about Carlos Carrasco, where the field is going to think Carrasco is a lot better than we do. So I'd go do all this. We'll stop right there. But do this for every single game. Reset your projections, let this update, and then run what I call a chalk build. So when you run a chalk build, and you could also, if you were short on time, especially on a 15-game slate, you could do this too, where you go in a way where you're not doing every single game, but you're looking for outliers. So maybe you leave everything that's at least within 0.3 runs away the same, but you're going to update everything that isn't, just so you get that, right? But you go in here and then run your chalk build. So the chalk build is basically setting this to cash, turning the impact of the sliders all the way off. Setting a stack rule. We'll use a 4-stack rule since we're playing on FanDuel because correlation's off, right? We still want to build stacks. We still want to see what kind of stacks people are going to build. And then set this to 150 and let this run. So if we really think through, like, what's the impact of what is taking place here is we're resetting the projections to look like what we think the industry average is going to look like. And then we're building actually 1,500 lineups of what we think a traditional optimizer would do if someone went in with some random set of average projections, said, build me 150 lineups with a 4-stack rule, and what lineups would come out of that. And when we look at that and we look at the full pool of 1,500, we start to get an idea of what ownership projections or where ownership would go for players that are building lineups like that, right? That's why I think this is such a valuable tool for identifying what the highest owned stacks are. And if you go through and update every team's team total, and again, I know it's a little tedious because you have to do it manually, and then you have to unfortunately manually reset it. The resetting part is going to change in our redesign coming out this month, which I'm very excited for. But for right now, it's manual. But you get really, really solid ideas of ownership. Like I think this is probably one of the best overall tools you could do to get overall an idea of what the field's going to do. We're talking about ways we can kind of incorporate more of this into our actual ownership projections here. But this, I think, is a really good way of assessing what the field is going to do. So we'll let this finish up. Again, I recommend opening up your field or your pool to see all of the lineups. And I think you really start to get an idea of what ownership's going to look like. Again, we didn't actually touch every single team. So there may be other outliers further down that we didn't actually mess with. But I could very easily see these kind of starting to look at what the pitching exposures look like when we're looking at stacks. I think these are probably going to be pretty likely. Detroit is a little bit of an interesting one. No, maybe not. right? These start to look like kind of the teams that I expect to be chalky. And they should generally match up to what the Vegas board looks like. If you want a really quick and dirty way to say who's going to be the chalkiest teams on the slate, just pull up the board and reverse this, right? And I mean, not reverse it, just look at the highest totals, right? This isn't going to be perfect. This isn't going to be surgical. We're not looking at DFS lineups and salaries and things like that. But if you wanted me to tell you what are the 5 teams that are the most likeliest to be the highest owned on both sites tonight, they would be the first 5 teams that you see listed here, right? This is again, a pretty easy like tool to quickly do that. But if you started to get into questions of like how much more owned are the Yankees going to be than the Orioles, that's when it can make more sense to do this kind of thing, right? But like this, I wouldn't be surprised if this is, again, with the exception of knowing that we haven't updated any team totals, but these end up working out really accurately. I've had great success with this, as this being a tool of determining where the field's going to go. So, again, if you wanted to be very thorough here, you wanted to get everything, do this for every team. And do it early, right? Especially in baseball, ownership's not going to change that much. Basketball, totally different story. Basketball, your tool to determine what the ownership projections are going to be is going to be, or where ownership's going to go, or where you can add value to ownership is going to be different, right? You're going to need to take some different approaches because the slate changes like that 5 minutes before lock. But baseball, even if the lineup cards are a little bit different, things rarely change the overall context of the slate dramatically. So you can run this now, right? And again, I know it's tedious. Got to go through and click all these in and whatever, but you can run it now. You got plenty of time to do it. Get an idea of what the ownership is going to be and go with it from there. And it probably will still be the same, later that day. Won't change that much. So, Ryan, that's what I would recommend doing. Like if you're finding that you're really struggling to identify the highest owned stacks, I would do this method. I would go through, update every single team total, run the chalk build at cash settings, 150 lineups, view your entire pool and look at it from there and see what is popping there. And just keep in mind, obviously, this changes based on the contest you're playing, right? But that's what I would recommend. So I'm going to reset these here real quick. This is why, to be completely honest, this is why this is very tedious because the projections reset every single time. It just takes a second. It's kind of annoying. I can definitely appreciate how annoying this is. We have a reset all button coming for this very soon. So it will ship with the visual update and the redesign that, again, is coming out here prior to football. But at the moment, a little bit tedious here. So let me go ahead and click 4 more buttons here real quick so I don't forget, because I want to get these back to normal. It's kind of fun. It's kind of a little game. No, it's not. It's not a little game at all, but we'll reset these. So, but okay, cool. So let's go ahead and just keep us moving here. We are halfway through our show here today. Still got plenty of questions, so we'll just keep it rolling. Got a decent audience here today. Thank you, everybody that's watching along with me, spending a little bit of their afternoon here. Next question was, when you were running your test build, do you take the top team SaberSim is giving you, or just go with the low-owned team? Good question. So you know what? Let's stay on FanDuel, because I never stay on FanDuel. I should be on FanDuel more. I always end up going to the DraftKings side. So let's run a test build. 20 lineups. See what we get. Give this a second here just to run. And I think the answer here is really, it depends. Or maybe even, I don't know. Let me see what we get out of this. I guess just kind of thinking about this out loud here, I'm probably not going to do just like one or the other of these things. So you can see, for example, here, right? Like the sliders are going to be set at a certain level based on your contest. So your ownership fade or your smart diversity here, right, are set assuming you're playing a 20 max at this entry level, right? So your exposures and the level to which that you're exposed to certain teams are are already kind of optimized for your contest and at least set at a good starting point. So you can see here, right? We have a ton of Scherzer and one Gilbert lineup, single pitcher site over on FanDuel. So since we're so concentrated on Scherzer, and since I'm pretty familiar overall with what Smart Diversity kind of does to a contest of this size, I already kind of know and kind of expect that our stacks are going to be pretty spread out, right? So yeah, we've got a lot of Dodgers, but otherwise we're kind of pretty well spread out. So I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with doing either of the things you've described here. This is from Clement. So for example, let's say like you are just looking at the Dodgers, right? And you say the Dodgers are the number one team. I want more Dodgers. You could do that and say, maybe I want 90% now. But what that might do, oh, it didn't. Okay. But what that might do on a different slate is then spread out your pitchers a little bit more. Or vice versa. You could say, okay, I want to go pick out some low-owned teams. I expect probably Pittsburgh and Kansas City are going to be not super chalky. So maybe I want extra exposure to Pittsburgh here. And maybe Kansas City too, because these are teams that are going to be low owned. Oh, can't do that. So this would be a good sign to me that you're doing too much, right? So maybe this is an indication that to do less here, or to go back to step one and adjust your exposures so that, or adjust your projections so that you're getting more. But yeah, I don't know. I think it kind of depends on like how I'm viewing the slate overall. And I don't think you necessarily need to feel like you have to make that kind of decision, right? Like these exposures are set in a way that is that we feel like makes sense for the contest. I don't feel like you necessarily need to come in here and say, okay, I'm all in on Dodgers, right? You can. Same thing with Pittsburgh, right? I don't think you need to come in here and say, okay, Pittsburgh's a low-owned team. They're my highest exposed lower-owned team, so I'm going to jump in and go hard on Pittsburgh. I think being at 20% exposed to them is a pretty good value. So I don't know. I think the one other thing I was thinking about with this question is from the standpoint of my research builds, where the answer is like a little bit different. So the research builds, if you are unfamiliar, let's first come back to the test build. So when we call a test build, what are we referring to? We're talking about using default settings. So entering our contest settings and just allowing SaberSim to use the default values of correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity to give us a build that's just like an initial impression of how we might want to tackle the slate based on SaberSim. When I run my research builds, I typically call them research builds. We also call them upside builds here sometimes on stream. What I end up doing is turning ownership fade off and turning smart diversity all the way up to 10. And what this is going to do is going to show us basically single game simulation optimals while also including stacks to give us an idea of what kinds of lineups or what kinds of teams have upside for the contest tonight, right? So this doesn't take into account ownership, right? This is going to take into account single game simulation, so it's going to be very volatile, but it's going to show us a build of pure upside, basically. And when I'm looking at a build like this, I think I am more likely, and Clement, I think maybe this is what your question was asking. I don't know which of these two kinds of builds that your question's really pointed at here. But when I'm running a build like a research build, then I think it comes down to a lot more like nuance, and there's a lot more subtlety here, and I'll start thinking about this a little bit more. So let's let this build finish, and I'll talk about how I kind of approach these things. But this is where it can be a little different. So I actually didn't build enough lineups. I'm gonna real quickly run. I want a big full pool of lineups here to answer this question. So you can see I asked it for 20. It only built me 200. I want 1,500 lineups because I'm trying to gauge in as many game simulations as I can how often certain teams are optimal. So I'm going to let a big full build run here, and we'll talk about this here in a second. But this is where I think I will be a little bit more thoughtful about how I want to tackle certain teams, right? Like a team showing up as your first most exposed stack on this research build means very different things to my process if they are going to be the overall chalkiest stack on the slate versus if they're going to be the third or fourth chalkiest stack on the slate versus if they're going to be a very low owned stack on the slate, right? And vice versa. if you have a team that is maybe the 5th most popular stack showing up in your research build, it is very different if that is a very low owned stack versus if that is the number 1 most owned stack in terms of the way I want to deal with that in my actual build. So let's let this build here. I think now that I'm talking this through in my head, I think the much more interesting way to talk about this question is through the lens of this build. Because when you run the test build, right, and we're considering the factors of ownership, and we have smart diversity set at the default slider settings already, and we're kind of at that final build, there's not really any way you can go wrong, right? You could go heavier on a low-owned team. You could go heavier on the most highly exposed team in your pool, right? Because all you're doing at that point is playing like a risk assessment game. This is more about, or like a risk aversion game. How exposed do you want to be to any one team? This is more about like leverage and assessing probabilities of success, which I think makes it a little bit more of an interesting question. So build is almost complete here. I think I managed to fill that time okay. All right, so what we'll do then is expand this up to 1,500, view the entire pool. Okay, so now we can look at this and compare it against how we want to tackle the slate. So for example, right, like let's see, let me think about how I want to discuss this. So I don't know, maybe let's look at just like the top 6 teams, right? Let's look at the top 6 teams. So that's the Dodgers, Tampa Bay, Oakland, Detroit, the White Sox, and the Yankees, right? So, and what we're essentially seeing here when we see 17.9% Dodgers, right? What's actually happening is that it's saying the Dodgers were an optimal stack. If the slate played out 1,500 times, the Dodgers were an optimal stack just under 18% of the time. So it's the most commonly optimal stack, but it only happens 18% of the time, right? The field, every other stack, is the optimal stack every other game sim, so 82% of the time, right? And the top overall teams make up or show up in the optimal lineup, I don't know, maybe 15, 30, 45, 60, 75 or so, 90% of the time, right? Features one of these top 6 teams. So I like to kind of look at this and then compare to how often what I think the field is going to do, or how I think the field is going to perceive these teams. And the way I like to do that, again, is against Vegas. So the Sox, the Yankees, the Tigers, and the A's all pop up in both our top 6 and Vegas's top 6. But the teams that are unique and missing here are the Dodgers and Tampa Bay. So if the field is going to think that the Dodgers are only a top 10 offense, but we think they are the top 1 offense, right? That's a big leverage opportunity. So now, I guess I should have done this in the other order. Now, I even feel better about our 75% Dodgers when we ran our test build, right? Not only does SaberSim just like them, right? That's a good thing. SaberSim thinks they're a good hitting team. We want to play them. But the field is undervaluing them, right? So now I'm even more inclined to play that team. Similarly, Tampa Bay is another one, right? Where's Tampa Bay? Even lower, right? This is another team, like in Fenway, great hitting park, right? Like I'm already getting excited about this team, but the field thinks they're like totally middle of the road tonight. We think they're the second best optimal team. So even though all these teams show up here in the top 6 and have roughly equal chances of being optimal, I feel very different about them in the way I would approach my test build because of what I think the field is likely to do with these teams. So now I want to make sure I'm still answering this question. So now let's go back to our like actual build we ran here and go back. So now looking at this question again, right? Do you just take the top team SaberSim is giving you? Well, now the answer to that question is yeah, like maybe I will just take the Dodgers, but I kind of understand why I'm doing that, right? I get what, like now I have a good reason to do that. The field is going to underweight their chances of being optimal on a slate like tonight. So I want to be 80%. So I'm just taking them. But let's say this was flipped and this was the Yankees, right? Or something like that. And again, like, yeah, the Yankees have a 17% chance, 15% chance of being optimal, 3rd highest on the slate, but the field thinks that too. I don't really get any leverage from doing that. So maybe I don't want to just take that team. And maybe I like, even if they were higher owned, but maybe I'm like going in and doing something like this to lower the chances of getting that team. Right. Similar to the same thing with the White Sox, right? Like, yeah, they have a good chance of being optimal, but I don't want to be like that exposed to them. Or Detroit, that's another team that the field I think is going to pick up. And then some of these lower owned teams start to pop up. So we get a little more Pittsburgh, we get a little more KC. Oh, that's not what I meant to do with Pittsburgh. I wanted to do that to the White Sox. Okay. Right. So like that's a really good way these two builds can work in conjunction here to give you some more context, to give you some more understanding, and to give you like maybe a stronger opinion of how you want to deal with these teams. Because it really does depend on the slate. It's not necessarily true that every single time I'm going to go in here and just fade or drop the ownership to the top exposed team, but sometimes I will. And same thing kind of the other way around, right? Sometimes like this might be all the leverage you need on the slate tonight. Highest chance of being optimal according to SaberSim. Top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Top 11 offense compared as far as the field is concerned. Might just be done deal. Like your leverage has been established. So anyway, I think I spent enough time on that question. I was just like talking about these kinds of things where I get an opportunity to talk about these test builds and research builds because it's so very close to home of how I actually play. If you want to see all this in action too, and you haven't already, I walked through on a strategy session from a couple weeks ago. Actually, it's the most recent one, 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago. I actually like showed you how I did all this live when building 150 lineups for the July 31st slate. This is up on YouTube under strategy sessions. If you want to see this. So like that was kind of a mini microcosm of how I might tackle tonight's slate, but this was an hour and 7 minutes of me actually doing it for 150 lineups on a slate a few weeks ago. So pretty cool. I don't know. I had fun doing it, but cool. Let's keep it going. All right. So, okay, good question here. Actually, I'm going to real quick, because we're now at the questions from the start of the show. So I'm going to hop over to YouTube chat here and make sure I got everything. So question from Ryan here. Using the sports betting tool lately, SaberSim almost always favors the dog on the run line. Do you think this is similar to what Max explained with unders that people don't like playing dogs? It could be. I think actually in general, like the data seems to show that people actually do like playing dogs. I think in general, people don't like to make bets on favorites. At least that's my understanding of what's common. But yeah, it looks like you are kind of right here in general. We do seem to be pretty heavily, or at least not heavily, but at least on average favored to the underdog on the run lines, which is interesting. I don't really know why that would be off the top of my head. So again, I know that our back testing for the season shows that we are beating these lines, especially at close, or even at close, I guess. So I maybe would assume that maybe the spreads aren't very efficient, or they're not reacting efficiently, or they're not following trends from the money lines or something like that. But I don't know if this is so much a public bias, because I think in general, the public prefers to bet the underdogs in general. I think that's kind of a common trend. At least that's true for money lines. Again, I'm a little bit out of my element here talking about some of the sports betting stuff. I am kind of all in on the DFS side. I don't do as much of the sports betting here stuff. So might be an interesting question. Maybe I can follow up with the team here, or maybe even see what Max thinks about why that seems to show up, because it definitely seems like there's a bit of a trend, at least for today. So cool. Let's go ahead. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to catch up all the way on YouTube here. Braden asked, favorite team to run tonight on the late night slate, really liking the Blue Jays. I would say, again, my strategy here isn't going to change dramatically based on slates. And this is another example of like how a traditional optimizer is just going to be so poorly equipped to deal with like anything out of the ordinary. Average projections in a traditional optimizer just don't know how to deal with that problem, right? Like you might have, there might be a cheat sheet out there or something for a main slate. Hey, here are the best plays. But we can actually use the same strategies to determine what are the most likely to be optimal plays on the late night slate, or even the chalk, right? So like you could do the same thing, and it's even more manageable here. Maybe you're playing the late night slate and you see our ownership projections, but you really want to get a really good idea of what's going to be chalky. Go in here, click late night, update the team totals, right? And then run your chalk build, and you'll get very close to good looking ownership projections for the late night slate. Then go in and run your research build. Run this and see who's popping. Who's popping more than they should, more than you expected, right? And put the two together, right? I guarantee you that San Diego is going to pop like crazy in the ownership build. Their ownership is probably going to be out of control. And you're going to see that teams like the Mariners and the Blue Jays and maybe even the Angels and Marlins and Rangers are going to show up. Like, having played a lot of these, I think those teams are going to show up as being under-owned based on their expectation for slates like this. 3 games, 2 games, 4 games, they regularly play out the exact same way, right? There's like the 1 single or 2 single stacks that are perceived as elite that are just massively owned, and nobody appreciates the upside potential of the other teams on the slate. So again, I haven't done this yet. It wouldn't surprise me if the Blue Jays popped as a team for the late night slate, right? That would had a greater chance of success given their likely ownership. So I wouldn't be surprised if I was on the Blue Jays as well. But again, that would be my strategy here: is use Vegas signals, use ownership projections, use the chalk build to get an idea of what the field's going to do, use the research build, high smart diversity builds to get an idea of how often teams are optimal, and find the rub in there. Where's the difference? What's not adding up? Who's under-owned, who's over-owned, and so on, and go from there. But Jim said, "You're so great to help like this every day." Thank you, man. I appreciate that. I enjoy it. So it's a pleasure. But let's keep going. Question from Neaton here. Hello. Yesterday, I ran 20 max build in the span of 20 to 25 minutes different twice. I was surprised to see that there were different results. Isn't the build results supposed to be static after lineups are out? Not necessarily, because of the way smart diversity works. So when you are building lineups using SaberSim, what smart diversity is going to do is it is going to pick out random buckets of game simulations and use them as the projections for each player when we build every single lineup. So the higher that this slider is to the right, the smaller those buckets of game simulations are, the more variant and diverse your lineups are going to be, even if nothing's changed. So if you have a smart diversity at 10, and then you run a build, and then 20 minutes later you run another one, it's likely that there's actually going to be quite a little bit of variance in between those builds, especially if you're only looking at the top 20 or so lineups, right? Because what's actually happening is we're building 500 and picking out the best 20. And when you just pick out that sample of 20, you're going to see some different exposures just because the variance of picking out these different bins of players is going to be, right? That's also reflective of how variant different sports are. A sport like baseball, you're going to see that on a very high smart diversity setting, it's going to have a bigger impact in between builds because hitters are very variant and ranges of outcomes actually are fairly wide. A lot of players have similar ceilings, and there's not a huge difference player to player of their actual overall ceiling expectation on a slate, right? In basketball, not only is smart diversity going to be lower by default, but it's also just going to be a little bit less variant of a game, and a lot of the same players are going to show up in between builds. But that's why you are seeing different lineups show up when you are running builds. I think that is overall a strength, and that's valuable, right? I don't want to give anyone the impression that, oh, the reason my builds are different when I run 2 builds is because smart diversity is on. I'm going to turn smart diversity off. Don't do that, right? This is a good thing. This is a way of naturally incorporating the variance of the game into your lineups, right? It is, let's flip this on its head. It is a flaw of traditional optimizers that every single time you press build, without using randomness, you get the identical same lineups. That is not a good thing. That is a flaw. That is an indication that traditional optimizers deal with the problem of variance very poorly, right? Because in reality, the slate is actually just going to play out one time. There is a ton of natural variance in the overall game, the sport, the slate, and it's important that we incorporate that into our lineups. We want that. We want our lineups to be different every time we build it, because it means that we're accurately thinking about the real ranges of outcomes of players and what can happen in these games. So, but really good question, really savvy observation, right? And that's why that's happening. So, but James said, I figured out how to view the Fantasy Labs content like what you're doing. Yeah, maybe I know you asked about that yesterday and maybe I misunderstood your question, but I just go directly to this link. Again, I know this is a competitor site for us. They just have a nice looking dashboard here. It's very clean to view implied live totals. So our hope is to at some point build something very similar to this, maybe into our sports betting product or something like that. But for now, I think it's a really clean view. So I like to use it, but it's literally fantasylabs.com/MLB/Vegas. So Ross said, good explanation. Thanks, man. Yeah, I assume that was when we were talking about the breakdown of the research build and stuff like that. But cool. We still have some questions left, so let's go ahead and keep going. And let's go here. Question from James. Could you walk us through how to use SaberSim's swap tool? I'm still confused how to use it. I know there's a tool, but if you could walk us through it, that would be super helpful. Sorry for being repetitive. You are not repetitive at all. No apologies needed here. The show is for questions, so ask questions. Yes, I can show you. So let's go ahead and get my template file in here so we can get some actual entries in. And I can walk through the swap tools a little bit here. Okay. So I need to get some lineups in here first. Do I have a build here that I can use? This will work. This is fine. I can use the 20 lineups. Probably a good thing so I can get actual lineups in here anyway and not have dummies in. So let's go ahead and do this. Yeah, okay. So we're going to do that. Download. Get these in here. Okay. All right, so we're in. Okay, so we have two swap tools available. We have Quick Swap and Late Swap. Quick Swap is basically going to be the global swap that both DraftKings and FanDuel have, but a way better version of that, right? So what it is going to do is you have two options. You can do all out players, which is going to be any player that's marked as out, or you can mark a specific player and say, for example, we wanted to get all of the Scherzer lineup out, all of the Scherzer out of our lineups very quickly, right? Well, different lineups are going to have different salary available. If it was a hitter or a position or a player that has multi-positional eligibility, it sometimes can just be a huge mess to do this quickly on the sites. So we give you two options here of saying you can either do the exact same specific player swap if you want to, but you could also just say best available. And then what we're going to do is apply and download, and it's going to just go ahead and pick the highest projected player that fits into the given salary requirements you have for your lineups and just fit that in. So we said, okay, Scherzer's out. Like the example here would be, let's say Scherzer got scratched 5 minutes before lock, right? First game on the slate. You've only got a little bit of time to make the move. You got to do something really quick. You can just do this, save, re-upload, and you know that very quickly you got the next best two pitchers in to lineups where you could fit those guys in, right? That's what Quick Swap does. That's the value of Quick Swap. It's quick, it's effective, and it lets you. It takes into account like the lineup context of the positional eligibility and the salary requirements. Late Swap is actually going to be a full rebuild of your lineups, locking in all the players whose game has already started, right? Actually, before I say this, I realize the example I just gave is not a great example because it was implying that the slate had not started yet. If the slate has not started yet and you have time, I would always recommend instead of using the swap tools to just do a fresh build, because then you'll get all the new information into your lineups. So I just wanted to stress that the swap tools are best used for after lock when you're actually swapping. But what Late Swap does is that it's going to lock in all the players whose game has already started into your lineups, exclude all the players whose games have started that aren't in your lineups, and then rebuild the best lineup around them, right? So again, using the Scherzer example, I know just as an example, let's say if Scherzer gets ruled out, well, actually all of a sudden the Phillies probably start looking like better plays. And you got no Phillies in your initial build. So if you do Quick Swap, yeah, you get Scherzer out, you get Gilbert and Carrasco in, and that's great. But you didn't get any extra Phillies. And it's probably true that now the Phillies are in a better hitting spot. Using Late Swap is going to allow you to get a better idea of the overall change in the context of the slate when big breaking news comes out. It takes a little longer because we have to rebuild all the lineups, but it only takes probably about 5 minutes or so, and it's actually going to rebuild all your lineups completely. So those are kind of the two differences between the tools. We have Quick Swap, which is very fast. It's not going to rebuild the lineups. It's just going to do it's going to do like a smart replace of all the out players or a specific player. And Late Swap is going to do a full rebuild of the lineups and build in the best new lineups overall around the players that you already have in the lineup. So I would say if it's before lock and you have time, always do a fresh build. If it's after lock and you have 10 minutes or more, I would probably do Late Swap. If it's after lock and you have 10 minutes or less to make a change, I would do Quick Swap. You can also do these combined. So one thing that I think a lot of the SaberSim guys like to do is when news breaks and you got to make something really fast is to do a quick swap, get the lineups in, get the out player out of your lineups, and then do a late swap so that you can actually rebuild the lineups if you have time. But at least you don't have a guy that's not playing in your lineup. So that's kind of the difference between those two. Again, nothing on the market like these. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about here, this is a add-on, the entry editor with Late Swap tool, $19 a month. It does have a free trial. So if you want to try this out, account management up in the upper right, and then down here, entry editor with Late Swap, $19 a month. You can start a trial and try this out. But I highly recommend checking it out. It is a pretty powerful tool, makes managing all this just a breeze, way easier. So those are the ways that the swap tools work. Really, really helpful for NBA. Baseball is one thing, right? But NBA, you might be late swapping like 5 or 6 times a slate. So, okay, cool. Let's keep it rolling. Question from Devin here. And he said, what are some ways to increase exposures to stacks you like or decrease exposure to stacks you don't like? How do you know by how much to increase or decrease by? Yeah. So from a how-to standpoint, right? You can do this in step 3 very easily just by engaging directly with the minimum and maximum exposures for teams. So let's go back here, right? So we build 500 lineups even when you just ask for 20 so that you can do this dynamically and adjust exposures quickly. So say we wanted actually 75% exposure to the Dodgers, right? You can just adjust this here. It's going to find the best lineups out of the pool and put them in, right? Same thing with maybe, I don't know, Baltimore. Maybe we only want 10% Baltimore. We can do this quickly, dynamically, edit exposures. So those, in answering what are some ways to increase exposures to stacks you like or decrease, like that is the easiest way. That is the best way to do this for your lineups, right? So that's what I'd recommend there. The more interesting question here is how do you know how much to increase or decrease by? This is a very difficult question because I think there's a lot to unpack here. I would say in very general terms, the more condensed you are on a certain team or player or stack type or anything like that, the higher your risk is, right? If we are 80% exposed to the Dodgers, our lineups are at much more risk if the Dodgers have a bad night than if we are 40% owned to the Dodgers, right? But they also have a lot more upside. If the Dodgers are the right stack or the highest scoring team on the night, we have twice as many lineups to capitalize on having the right other pieces like the supporting stack and the pitchers, right? So you have higher upside, higher risk, the more exposed you are to a certain player or team or stack type. So that's an important thing to note, right? How much to increase or decrease by is not something that can necessarily just be explained by like game theory or math because it depends on your particular risk assessment. So with that said, I like to use the default values as a way to kind of get an idea of at least a way to like, I don't know what I'm trying to say, as a way to kind of benchmark what's appropriate for the slate, right? In some ways, you could look at this and say that for a 20 max with default settings, SaberSim doesn't really think that it makes any sense to be more than 50% or so exposed to your highest stack of the night. So maybe that team for you is, I don't know, St. Louis. But maybe we are using SaberSim's recommendations of how exposed to be on the team. But I guess what I'm saying is maybe we're bumping up St. Louis, but we're not getting overly exposed. We're not getting more overly exposed than SaberSim might have recommended to us to be on the slate anyway, right? So we've set a 45% exposure to St. Louis. Maybe we cap the Dodgers back down, and we're like tackling the slate like this. We were still able to leave our mark on the slate, but we're playing in the way that our stacks are exposed as about to what SaberSim advised us to do, right? Again, SaberSim is an advisor. That's the way I always like to think about this. What can we use what the app is telling us to then put our value into the process? But it's perfectly fine to also say that I'm fine playing a very risky approach, and I want to be very exposed to the team that I am very much on tonight, and that's the Cardinals. So I'm 80% exposed to the Cardinals. Again, it's more about what is your risk portfolio. What are you comfortable with in terms of risk in your lineups? And I would say in general, run a test build, right? And get an idea of what SaberSim thinks is appropriate maximum exposure to any stack in the pool, and use that. If you're unsure of how to do this, use that as like a baseline. So I would say, like for DraftKings tonight, test build, it says, our favorite teams on the slate, maybe we want about 50% exposure. Okay, I'll go in and adjust some of my favorite teams to be at about 50% or something like that. I think that's a good median approach that won't really be overly exposed or not. And that has to do with overall, like the context of the slate overall. When typically on baseball, when your stacks are pretty spread, it typically means it's because you have something like this going on where your pitchers are very concentrated, right? SaberSim is making some level of a statement to us saying that Max Scherzer is like the best overall play on the slate. So we're going to play 90% Scherzer, and we're going to be pretty spread out in our stacks, because it doesn't make sense to be so overly concentrated where your stacks were super concentrated and your pitchers were super concentrated for a contest of this type, which is why this kind of line of thinking works, why this makes sense. On the hitter side, or not on the hitter side, but on the actual position player side, I think the other way to approach this is to do it from the lens of exposure versus projected ownership, and thinking about how exposed you want to be to certain players relative to the field. So you can see, for example, we've got these two players. We've got Anthony Alford and Trey Turner, who are almost exposed the exact same amount. These actually have a very different impact on our overall lineup portfolio, because on a player like Trey Turner, we are basically 3 times as exposed to the field. And on a player like Anthony Alford, we are essentially close to 9 times as exposed. So even though these players only have one lineup different, our approach to them would be very different overall. Say we wanted to tone down some of the exposure here, and we wanted to just be 2 times exposed to both players. Well, what we would actually do is we would adjust this to like 35, because then we're twice as exposed. And Alford, we would actually adjust to maybe just like 15, right? And even though we adjusted these exposures to different numbers, now we are roughly 3 times over the field on both players. So you can use the projected ownerships as kind of a guideline or a guide marker of determining how exposed you want to be to a certain player. If you like a player and he's 5% owned, how much do you like him? Do you need to be 10 times as owned to the field on that guy? Do you want 50% exposure? Do you want 100? Do you want 10? Wait, what? I got confused. Do you need to be 10 times as exposed to that player on the field? Do you want to lock him in? Right? There's a lot of different ways to do that. So overall, it depends on your risk. It depends on it depends on the projected ownership of individual players, but I would say you can use kind of the general guidelines of what the builder is going to give you by default as an idea for stacks of how much exposure it makes sense to be on one particular team. But great question. James asked, what is a template tool? I don't know. I'm not really sure. Did I say template tool at some point? Or I would be interested to hear where you heard that. I don't know. I don't know what that is. And do you use this every time you play? I saw this pop in when I was talking about the swap tools. I will if there's news. So like in baseball, it's pretty much coming down to if all the lineups are in or not, and if a player gets scratched after lock. If all the lineups are not in when we go into lock, it's very likely that I'm either going to quick swap or late swap later that night. If a player gets scratched, it's overwhelmingly likely that I'm quick swapping or late swapping later that night. And that's just baseball, right? In basketball, I am quick swapping. I am late swapping constantly, right? Every time a new lineup comes out, which is pretty much like every time there's a new set of games that are about to start, you kind of have to do a late swap. So yeah, I use it a ton. But all right. Cool. I think we have gotten through all of the questions here so far. Man, it was another really fun day in here. We talked, what did we talk about? We talked about a lot. We talked about definitely some interesting conversations about exposures and what the appropriate amount of exposure makes sense for certain players. And also, of course, how to use max exposure and what max exposure is actually doing. We kind of worked through some test builds, some research builds, talking again about how to find leverage and how to find the lower owned high upside stacks, both for the main slate and also some of the stuff for the late slate. We talked a little bit about chalk, right? We did some more chalk builds, identifying chalk constructions using SaberSim as kind of a traditional optimizer or pretending to be a traditional optimizer to get an idea of what the field is going to do. We talked about late swap and test builds. We were all over the place today. It was a great show. Thanks, Jim, for being here today, asking some questions, being a part of this. It was a lot of fun. So we will be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Get your questions ready for me. Enjoy the 15-game slate tonight as you're working through it. If you have questions or things come up or you have some thoughts, pop them into the Slack channel overnight, and we'll make sure we get to them right at the start of the show tomorrow. But we will be right back here again tomorrow. Again, 2 p.m. Eastern. Should be fun. Looking forward to seeing you guys all here again. And until then, take care. See ya.